Hello everybody. It is Monday, the 30th of April 2012, and we are here in Limache, Chile, South America. And I'm sitting here with Howard Richards. Howard Richards is a philosopher of social science and one of the most ferocious thinkers I have ever met. You were thinking continuously and writing and developing thoughts.
She says she can hear my brain going.
Yes, yes. So, and I think it's very important to know where a great thinker comes from. He just doesn't fall from the sky. There is a biography, there is a background. And I would be so glad if you could share with us, I heard this story from your grandfather in Denmark, which really impressed me. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was my great-grandfather. He was he was a blacksmith in Copenhagen, and the Mormon missionaries came. They were founding their utopian community out in Utah, and they needed certain types, so they needed a blacksmith. So they went to recruit a blacksmith, and the story in the family is they gave my great-grandfather a copy of the Book of Mormon. He went upstairs and stayed upstairs for 2 days. And then he came down on the staircase and he said, "I have read this book and it is true." He later became a bishop of the Mormon church in Utah after he immigrated, went across the water and across the plain.
And he
packed up and left with his wife Caroline, my great-grandmother. And Caroline pushed a handcart across the plains from Missouri to Utah, following Brigham Young.
Okay.
So he later married 2 other women, which Caroline was not happy about. He had 3 wives. And on her deathbed, another family story, he said, his deathbed, he said to her, "I am going to heaven to prepare a place for you." And Caroline said, "I have earned my place." These are family legends from a family of people who are no longer Mormons but have a Mormon background.
Mm-hmm. And how did you come out of this family?
Well, I was born in Pasadena, and I suppose I came out of the family in the sense that my mother revolted against the church. She was a Mormon when she was a little girl. Okay. There's another little story about how she left the church, the Mormon church. She started reading Henri Bergson, the philosopher. So she went to her elder at her stake of the Mormon church, and she said to the elder, "Am I allowed to read Henri Bergson?" And he said, "I'll have to ask Salt Lake." And then 2 weeks later, he came back to her and said, "Salt Lake says no."
So Henri Bergson was out, or she was out of the Mormon church.
So my family suffered a great deal in the Depression. I think that's one way that my concern for social issues comes out of it. At the age of 11, I observed that my father was unemployed, chronically unemployed. He was a truck mechanic who had a job during the war, but as soon as the war was over, the normal times returned, and there was a certain number of people who were not employable, and he was not especially skilled, and he had a rather rough personality, and he was not really employable, but he didn't want his wife to work. My mother had worked as a secretary for Texaco before marriage, but after marriage she couldn't work. So he was unemployed and would not allow his wife to work. So there's got to be something wrong with patriarchal capitalism. I figured that out at the age of 11. It wasn't just a psychological problem, there was a structural problem here.
How fascinating.
Actually, I've gotten in the business now of offering psychological solutions for economic problems, but at that point I thought it was an insight to see this wasn't an individual who was messed up and didn't know how to function. This was a whole social pattern that wasn't working.
Right. And where does your father come from? Your mother comes from this family, from the Mormon background, and she then turned against the Mormon church?
Yeah, my father comes from New England. I was born in Winsted, Connecticut, of a long line of a decreasing family. When you see a family tree, you usually see there's the progenitor and the progenitor has 15 grandchildren, each of them has 6 grandchildren, so it multiplies as time goes on. If you look at my puritanical New England family tree, it's the opposite. Back then there were lots of us, and there was more and more there was, you know, an only child of an only child, or people with no children. So my father was an only child, his father was an only child, and his mother was an only child. So, and they went broke in the Depression, and they jumped into an old 32, well, it was I got this wrong. In 1932, they got into a Model T and drove across the country to Pasadena, where
they got
into a Model T Ford.
Right.
Right.
And
when they got to Pasadena,
to look for a better fortune, or
to look for a better fortune in Southern California. My grandfather died. I never met my grandfather, so it was my grandmother and her son, my father, who went across the country on Route 66 and ended up in Pasadena, where my grandmother married a Swede who was born on a boat halfway between Stockholm and Brooklyn, and they opened a rooming house in Pasadena. So much of my youth was spent in a rooming house in Pasadena. As my father's inability to find work and unwillingness to allow my mother to work meant that we had to live with my grandparents because my parents had no income.
And is there anybody in your family as intellectual as you are? Or was there?
There was my Uncle Jack. He died in World War II. He was my hero, was my Uncle Jack. He died in Holland. He wanted to fight Hitler, and he volunteered, and he was underweight. So he gained weight so he could get in the army, so he could fight Hitler. And he knew he was good at mathematics. So he got into officer school, he became a second lieutenant. He was killed on Palm Sunday of 1944 by a German bomb in Holland. And he was the bright spot in the family. He was the intellectual, the political actor. Well, he was the one who had a job. Most of my relatives didn't even have a job. But he was the sort of the shining star of our family. And he was my favorite uncle. I inherited his slide rule.
Inherited
his slide rule. You know, he used to do like mathematical calculations with a slide rule. You don't do it anymore because of computers. So yeah.
And what was intellectual about him, or what was inspiring you?
Well, he was a great social activist. He was active in Upton Sinclair's campaign for governor of California. You know, he read all the time. He studied all the time. My mother was an intellectual too. She entered UCLA at the age of 12. She got a prize for being the best student of the Spanish language in the Los Angeles public schools back in 1920. Her sister, my mother's sister. My Uncle Jack was my mother's sister.
Brother.
Brother, excuse me. Yeah, My mother was Uncle Jack's sister. Right. Uncle Jack was.
So there were two of your, you know, the mother and her brother who were really somehow kind of inspiring you. You could say that.
Yes, they were certainly into classical music and reading books and going to the museum. My mother in particular, she read about child psychology, so she tried to bring me up in the way that child psychology recommended. And one thing she did, this may be a crackpot theory, but she went to the Henry Huntington Art Library and Museum, which is in San Marino, California, while she was pregnant. So she went around and she looked at, you know, Blue Boy and Pinky and these great paintings which have come to the Henry Huntington Art Gallery, so that her unborn child
would have an aesthetic experience.
Aesthetic experience. So I've often gone back to San Marino to the Huntington Gardens and Art Gallery and thought about my mother taking me there when I wasn't born yet. But yeah, I was really my mother's idol.
Okay.
And so one reason I think I have such an excessive overconfidence is that my mother expected everything from me. She always wanted me to be the person who would, you know, turn the world around and save it.
And you do.
Well, I'm trying.
She would be proud.
Well, she was proud. Believe me, she was really proud. I was the apple of her eye, so to speak. Every time I did something that was notable, she was quite proud. She was a a school teacher. She taught 3rd grade. So ask me something else.
I think perhaps this is enough
Okay.
for now. Don't you think so? What else would you...
Well, maybe I should mention Caroline. She sort of,
Yeah.
I was sort of a nutty kid from Southern California, and she sort of brought me, she's my partner, wife. She says, you know, I don't really believe in being a wife, but I have to admit I am one. She sort of brought me into the mainstream, so to speak, into a sort of society of people who are not as sort of loony and offbeat as all of my friends and relatives were growing up in Southern California, where all the fruits and nuts are. She's from Nebraska.
Okay.
See? So I'm a Southern Californian who married a Nebraskan, and it seemed to turn out for the best.
And you have 2 lovely daughters?
Yes, we have 2 lovely daughters.